Hi, welcome to session 13 of History 3375, CIA in the Third World. Today's session is the last session of the course, and what I'm going to do in the first half of today's session is provide essentially a summary lecture, pulling together some of the major themes of the course. Not a real review in this first half, but what are some of the major themes that we started out with and tried to develop over the length of these 13 weeks. How do some of these ideas fit together? This is helpful both for a review because it gives you an emphasis on some of the main ideas, and also in case there should be a question on the final, which is a broad and general question. Stop. Huh? Okay, well, whatever. That's okay. We'll continue on. So that's what we're going to do in the first half. The second half is a review that I'll go over, again, some of the nitty-gritty points that I covered in the very first session. Come on back. You're enjoying this too much. Since we don't have any slides today. So in the second half, it is a real review. It'll start with some of those same points about how are the exams structured. It's identical to some of the very first part of session 1, where I went over the nitty-gritty details of the course, and then we'll get into exploring what are some possible topics, questions that could be asked without getting too specific, because of course this is a course that's going to be shown over and over again. The questions will vary over time, but to give you as much guidance as possible what to be looking for in terms of questions for the final exam, and what are some of the things that you need to keep in mind in answering those questions, all right? So first part is thematic, the second half is a very specific review that we'll go through. All right, I think we're going to go to the first slide, but we'll see. In any case, no, we're not. We're not going to the first slide. Forget the first slide. That's okay. At least the fire alarms aren't going off. Hey, this happens on broadcast TV. It can certainly happen on educational television. All right, now for the first slide. Okay, there is the first slide. I began the course talking about American foreign policy, and rather than getting into specifics of treaties and all that, what I talked about were the ideas that comprised over time the American mission. How did the American people see themselves in the context of the larger globe itself? What did they see as their mission? And I think it's a very specific mission, although it evolved over time. The early settlers in the British colonies and Americans in the 18th century saw these colonies and this new nation as a very exceptional kind of place from a religious perspective. It was the New Jerusalem. It was to be the rebirth of Christianity that they saw as corrupted in its European form. Here would be a purer form. And this was what America had to bring to the rest of the world, was this purer form of Christianity. So it was very much a religious vision. But blended in with that, by the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, was also a secular vision, that the exceptionalism of America was not restricted just to religious beliefs, but to its political institutions, specifically to the idea of Republican form of government, in other words, elected representatives, and of course the whole idea of a nation state, that this is how people should be organized, not around some monarchy, some dynasty, but around the concept of a nation state, that they constituted a common community. And it was these ideas, especially about republicanism and about their Protestant Christianity, that Americans were anxious to share with the rest of the world. Now, in the 19th century, this mission takes on, as we saw, an aspect of territorial expansion. Some of it peaceful, such as the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase, large territories along the Mississippi River controlled by France and acquired by the United States under Thomas Jefferson. But later, a more violent expression of this territorial expansionism, and this expansionism seen as essential to social stability. really from the early days of the American nation, all the way back to the late 18th century, there was a belief among the founding fathers that one of the things that helped maintain stability that was essential to social stability in this nation was its ability to expand westward, to add new territories, so that those who had not been successful in moving up the economic and social ladder on the East Coast could move westward, establish homesteads, and gain economic advantage and social advancement in that fashion. So that the frontier was essentially a safety valve, a release valve for these pressures that normally disrupted other societies that could not expand in this way. But as I said, this expansionist process also took on a violent form in the war against Mexico in the 1840s, when the United States attacked Mexico and seized almost half of Mexico's national territory. The American mission still had these elements of spreading religious Protestantism and Republican institutions, but added to that were strong racist attitudes that now predominated in the United States, attitudes that for Americans helped explain why groups like African Americans, who were still enslaved at this time, and Native Americans were consistently in inferior social and economic positions when this was supposed to be a society conceived in liberty. The explanation was, well, they are fundamentally inferior. They are racially inferior. That's what explained why they are at the bottom of this society economically and socially. That same interpretation was applied to Mexico and to the people of Mexico, arguing that they were not fit to rule, to civilize their own society, and that therefore justified the American invasion and the American occupation of vast territories. However, this territorial expansionism that was so much a part of the American vision in the first half of the 19th century was already disintegrating at the time of the war in Mexico because of the strong conflicts within the United States over the issue of slavery. The divisions between North and South, the battles over whether newly added territories, including those acquired from Mexico, would be free or slave. And as a result, the consensus for expansionism, territorial expansionism, that was so dominant into the 1840s had largely fallen apart by the 1850s. By the time of the Civil War, Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, has reconceived the idea of American expansionism. It is no longer to be focused primarily on territorial expansion, although most of us remember Seward for acquiring Alaska, but that was not Seward's major concern. It was not territorial expansion, but rather commercial expansion, that the United States could create a commercial empire because of the tremendous productivity of its agricultural lands and its growing industrial prowess, that a trade empire was what America would now seek. This was the new kind of empire. By the end of the 19th century, another element of the mission is added. The war in Cuba, the invasion of Cuba by the United States, the defeat of the Spanish, who were battling to maintain control of their colony, marks a new stage in the development of this mission, this vision. Because now Americans see themselves on a civilizing mission. They still very much incorporate those racist ideas that were apparent back in the 1840s. But now the idea is, well, these societies are inferior because of their racial composition, but we can bring a degree of civilization to them. We have a mission to civilize these societies by bringing elements of our own American institutions, education, public works projects, the emphasis on private property and laws to protect it, constitutional government. So this was to be the new mission of the United States, a civilizing mission where we would intervene in other societies composed of what we described as racially inferior groups, and then uplift them to a degree by providing these reforms, these changes in their societies, so that they would at least approximate what Americans saw as the strongest characteristics of their own society. That mission expands into much of the Western Hemisphere in the early decades of the 20th century. There are interventions into Haiti. We've seen the one in Nicaragua, the occupation of the Dominican Republic, and in all of these cases, the United States tries to carry out similar reforms to those that were instituted in Cuba with the same idea, that we will create miniature versions of our own, as it was described at the time, Anglo-Saxon Republic. And Anglo-Saxon Republic, of course, referred to the fact that we saw our country as a liberal Republican form of government, but one that was dominated by the white race because it was considered to be the superior race. So this is the civilizing mission that begins in the late 19th century and carries into the early decades of the 20th century with a particular focus on our main sphere of influence, which, of course, is the Western Hemisphere. Another element that begins to embed itself in the American mission and the American vision by the 1920s is the concept of consumerism. By now, the religious elements of this mission, this vision, while they are still there, there are Protestant missionaries who are working in Latin America, they're working in China. That part of the mission has become a relatively insignificant element compared to the emphasis on material changes that Americans can bring to other societies. The emphasis is clearly focused on material change, and not just the kinds of changes that we mentioned earlier of building roads and public works facilities of other types, railroads, and beginning public school systems, but also the development of consumer society. That had already taken off in the United States in the latter part of the 19th century and was blossoming certainly by the 1920s. And a consumer society means more than simply the buying of consumer goods and services. That certainly is its key characteristic and how we recognize it. We readily admit today that ours is a consumer society, consumer-driven. The economy is driven by personal consumption. But consumer society means more than that. It means the idea that human happiness lies precisely in the acquisition of these material goods and services in a free market economy. This is the emphasis on how human happiness is to be achieved. Despite the fact that we see ourselves as a very religious nation, nevertheless, the main emphasis in the 20th century, certainly by the 1920s and beyond, was that the special gift that Americans had to carry to other societies was this concept of consumerism, was the idea that this is how human beings could achieve happiness with the consumption of these goods, and of course is the message that is conveyed more and more powerfully year after year by advertising, by marketing arrangements, and now of course has penetrated virtually the entire globe. One of the key elements in bringing this message and instituting the practices of consumer societies or encouraging the development of consumer societies in the world in the 20th century and right into our own time was the development of American multinational corporations. As much as the state is there, the fact is the state is not the main purveyor of this part of the American mission. The main purveyor of this part of the mission is American business. They are the ones out promoting American consumer products, Coca-Cola, General Electric with its household appliances, General Motors with automobiles. These are the institutions that are most powerfully transmitting this message, and that, of course, is carried as well by the technologies that Americans help establish in other societies, such as radio transmissions, etc. And later, of course, television, movies. These are powerful corporate messages that begin penetrating the rest of the world, certainly in Latin America in the 1920s, but spreading beyond that to most of the globe beginning in the 1940s and beyond. Now, I mentioned that this message was largely the work of multinationals, and it is true. And it's fair to say that at least up until the 1930s, there wasn't a great deal of coordination in the American mission. Even though I can describe it to you and say, look, these were its principal characteristics, the fact is that American business, American religious missionaries, the U.S. government, American labor organizations, etc., were all part of this, but often operating very much on their own and in many cases having conflicting agendas even as they pursued similar goals. However, the Great Depression, beginning in 1929, helps forge a close-knit alliance among these various groups. The Depression, of course, threatened the very foundations of the American economy and American society. Millions of people would cast votes for the Communist Party, for the Socialist Party in the midst of the Great Depression, certain that the capitalist system was collapsing not only here, but worldwide. American corporate leaders, American political elites were desperate to salvage the situation, to rescue the economy and avoid social collapse and revolution. Under Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic Party, an alliance emerged between the Democratic Party, the leaders of capital-intensive industries such as General Electric, and organized labor. It had a common set of goals: to revive the Depression-racked world economy, to promote the revival of international trade, and to promote the expansion of U.S. investment overseas. For the government, it was the logical course in order to try to revive the economy. It had domestic policies as well, of course, but the international economy would also have to grow if America was to recover. For the corporations that were involved, the high-tech, capital-intensive industries of their day, the oil industry, General Electric, etc., they knew that they had a comparative advantage in the world economy because of their technologies, but they could only take advantage of it if they could revive the world economy and thereby create new investment opportunities for themselves and new opportunities to sell their products overseas. For labor, the revival of the economy, of course, meant jobs, increases in wages. And, of course, the capital-intensive corporations are quite willing to allow a degree of this to occur because, of course, labor is a smaller part of their costs, and therefore they can be more amenable when it comes to the demands of labor. So these groups forge the core of this alliance. Along the way, they will receive cooperation from other elements, such as private foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, that are pursuing similar kinds of goals in the world, often taking up some of the same reformist ideas that Protestant missionaries had so energetically pursued in earlier decades. Now, by the end of World War II, this alliance has developed some very specific ideas about how this is going to work. The general idea is, yes, get the international economy revived, open up investment opportunities for American business overseas, and some of that is already taking place. The war is certainly a help in reviving the economy overall and the global economy as well. But beyond that, another central idea, particularly as they take their goals overseas, is the idea of productivity. What is it that we are bringing that's so special that other cultures and societies should welcome this American mission? The ability of American technology, American corporations, to rapidly accelerate productivity. In other words, greater productive efficiency, more product being produced by each individual working in the economy. This was essentially the promise of the Marshall Plan for Europe and rebuilding a war-shattered Europe, was that not only would American dollars flow in, but the Americans would help by providing upgrades in productivity that would speed the economic recovery. And much the same was true in Japan. Here, these ideas for the American mission and this idea of productivity was highly successful. But the same ideas would be practiced or attempted in the Third World, in Latin America, Africa, parts of Asia. The critical idea was that we can provide increased productivity. We can provide a rapidly growing economy. We can provide more and more wealth that will then trickle down through the society so that all benefit in the end. And the critical part of that is that you don't need a revolution. You don't need to radically alter the systems of economic, political, and social power. Those structures, those relationships can remain essentially as they are, because our technology, our ability to accelerate productivity will bring material benefits to all levels of society. It was an alternative, of course, to calls for communist revolution that were now having a powerful resonance in the Third World, given the specific example of the Soviet Union and then later the People's Republic of China. Even more specific to the Third World was the development during the 1950s of what was known as Modernization Theory. Modernization Theory said there are two kinds of societies: modern, traditional. What's modern? America is modern. Modern society is marked by a sense of independence by individuals, an emphasis on rational solutions to problems, an emphasis on individual accomplishment, an emphasis on economic growth, and, of course, political elements of democracy. This is what a modern society is basically about. What's a traditional society? Traditional society, there is little emphasis on individual initiative. There is emphasis on a patriarchal order, a hierarchy in society, where one is deferential to one's social betters, where you do not expect to move up significantly economically and socially, where there is not an emphasis on rational problem solving, but a reliance on traditional values, where there is not self-sustaining economic development. Walter Rostow wrote a famous book, The Stages of Economic Growth, which, as his subtitle indicated, was meant as an anti-communist treatise. In other words, here's the capitalist answer to communism. And it isn't just a matter of contrasting these two systems. What Rostow was explaining is we can make modernization happen in other societies. We can socially engineer other societies. We can provide the inputs so that these traditional societies will change into modern societies. So now we actually have a blueprint for social engineering called modernization theory. And we're going to try to apply that in much of the Third World during the 1950s, 60s, and into the 1970s. This is the new version of the Civilizing Mission. We no longer say that other societies are inferior because of race. It's a matter of, well, there are differences in culture. This is a traditional culture, ours is a modern culture. But we can change the traditional culture. Of course, there's still a patronizing attitude, just as there was in the Civilizing Mission. The Civilizing Mission, we were saying, well, you people are racially inferior, but we can help. Now we say, well, it's not that you're racially inferior, but you're still inferior because you're not modern, you're traditional, and again, we can help. We have the mechanisms. We'll have some aid programs, we'll help introduce some of our technologies, and we can re-engineer your society, improve education, so that we create the kinds of people that are needed in a modern society. The United States is in a position to experiment with modernization theory to make it the sort of ideological center of its mission in the decades after World War II, because the United States is the unrivaled world power. As much as we compete with the Soviet Union and talk about an arms race in the Cold War, the reality is when you add up the numbers militarily, economically, the United States was always far superior to the Soviet Union, even though Americans often convinced themselves that they were in imminent danger of being overrun by the Soviets. The truth was the scales were always weighted very heavily in favor of the United States. The New World Order that the United States will try to create through the concepts of modernization theory had certain key characteristics. That there would be free trade and investment, same kind of thing that was conceived of by that coalition during the Great Depression. There'll be representative government. Again, that's a characteristic we expect in modern societies. There'll be consumerism, because that, of course, is now a critical element of modern society, because it's a critical element of American society. There'll be secularism. This is a part of the idea of rational thought, that we separate religious beliefs, which are fine over here in terms of people's ethical standards and spiritual values, but when it comes to day-to-day events in society and solving problems, we don't pray to God to launch a rocket. We turn to engineers, their slide rules, and later their computers to design a system that will get the rocket off the ground. So that's secularism, and that's an important part of what we promote in the world, and also individualism, that the system works because we have individuals who are competitive and ambitious, looking to move up in our system, and those are the kinds of people we need to help nurture in other societies to create other modern societies. But these would be the characteristics of this new world order that we want to see thriving around the globe. Now, to achieve that, the United States also sets about creating a series of ancillary institutions. In other words, institutions that will assist in carrying out this mission. It isn't just going to be American government, big business, American labor unions. No, there need to be other institutions. Multilateral institutions, in other words, involving other countries. The International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, the World Bank, the United States Information Service, which is, of course, a U.S. government agency, as are the United States Agency for International Development, an important part of any nation-building project, and, of course, the focus of our interest, the Central Intelligence Agency. And each of these groups, in their own way, assist in pursuing this idea of modernization, whether it's the World Bank and USAID providing development grants, the IMF promoting free markets through its loans that help solve currency problems and debt problems, the United States Information Service spreading the ideas of modernization and how American modernization is the ideal to which most humans aspire. However, of course, these ideas didn't go completely unchallenged. There are considerable forces out there in the world, especially in the third world, that are opposed to many elements of this project or this mission. We saw the rise of third world nationalism in those societies emerging from colonialism after the Second World War. Very often these societies were anti-Western, and thereby, obviously, anti-American, because of their long history of being subordinated to the West. They often were anti-capitalist because they felt that their economic underdevelopment was a direct product of them being subjected to capitalist systems. They often promoted ideas of economic nationalism. In other words, we want to control our own economy. We don't want foreigners dominating it with investments in mining and agriculture, what have you, banking, etc. And considerable experimentation with ideas of socialism. No, we don't want a capitalist economy. We want an economy where there is redistribution of wealth, ready access to the resources of society, and that it's not all based on free markets. The Americans got a jolting example of how these ideas could combine in the very place where they had launched their civilizing mission more than half a century earlier. In Cuba in 1959, with the Cuban Revolution, here was the place that Americans had spent billions of dollars upon. Back to the time of Leonard Wood, had tried to transform Cuban educational systems, Cuban law, etc., and the Cuban people had been subject to American influence of various kinds, political, economic, social, for more than half a century. And yet here, this very same place, we have this Marxist revolution, with Castro nationalizing $1 billion of U.S. investment, setting up a socialist society, and finally declaring himself a Marxist-Leninist, which is saying that he's a communist. Here was a direct and shattering challenge to what Americans were trying to accomplish in their mission after World War II. And if we go back to the slide, we'll see I make a reference here to the Magnificent Seven. Chris Adams is a character in the film The Magnificent Seven. He's the leader of the gunmen who ride into a small Mexican village, brought there by the appeal of the villagers to save them from the bearded bandit chief who periodically rapes and pillages in their village. And Adams and his fellow gunfighters come from America with their technologies to save these people from this bearded autocrat who exploits them. As American moviegoers sat riveted to the scenes of The Magnificent Seven in 1960, another band of Americans, this group very real, not fictional, was working to save another group of Latin people from what they saw as another bearded autocrat. Richard Bissell and his assistants at the CIA were plotting the Bay of Pigs invasion. And they saw themselves very much as Chris Adams is conceived by the American movie maker, as the saviors of this Latin population. Obviously, these people haven't, of their own volition, rejected the American mission, rejected the American ideas about modernization. They have to be the victims. So the Americans are going to use their technology, not six guns, a little more advanced weaponry, their rational planning, to save these people from another bearded tyrant. That event marked another step in the American mission. That now, more than ever, the United States was going to turn towards more violent responses to challenges coming from the Third World to the American mission. If the mission has been rejected by the revolution must be a corrupting influence, must be evil. We will save these people from it. Obviously, Bissell, with his horn-rimmed glasses and his tweed suits, would hardly be mistaken for the black-clad gunslinger Chris Adams. But they had the same kind of vision, a vision that would heavily influence the United States in the decades ahead. That same kind of vision would inspire what the Americans were in the process of doing in Vietnam. the special forces, highly trained Americans, professionals, would go out and undermine the communist insurgency in the South. Well, at the same time, skilled technicians versed in the ideas and the techniques of modernization theory would build a nation where there had been none in South Vietnam. So we would both fight the communist insurgency by taking up arms, but also use our technological skills and the guidance of modernization theory to build a nation. And this would become a new and very common pattern for the United States through the 1960s, 70s, and of course, there are dramatic echoes of these same ideas in Iraq today. Indeed, when we look at this latest example, I should say, of the invasion of Iraq, and the use of the ideas of the American mission, we see America confronting the newest challenge to that mission. For a very long time, it was third world nationalism, combined with Marxism, Leninism, communist influence, sometimes a combination of both, sometimes distinct, as we have seen in the different cases that we examined. The new challenge, of course, is not from another Western ideology like socialism or communism, but from Islamism. A radical version, a politicized version of Islam, but one which does capture the divergence between Islamic cultures and Western cultures. If we look again at the American mission and some of its key characteristics, such as secularism and materialism, these are ideas that clash in many ways with some of the fundamental principles of Islam. So there is reason for conflict. Are they irreconcilable differences? That's a matter of intellectual debate. What we do know is that there is friction. Because if we just take the example of secularism and the idea that, well, all real-world problems are to be dealt with through rational thought, objective analysis, as opposed to Islam's vision that there is religious guidance for establishing the basic principles and laws of society, we see reasons why there are sharp differences and divergences. But beyond that, there are also specific triggers that have helped accelerate the development of Islamism as this radical version, this radical response to the West. The U.S.'s economic dominance in the Middle East, its control in various ways of much of the oil supply of the region, the military dominance of the United States, originally envisioned as the military prowess of Israel, but in more recent years, particularly since 1991, seen as direct U.S. military intervention in the Middle East. The Arab-Israeli conflict, which is conceived of, certainly in Arab societies, as a conflict between an ally of the United States that has subordinated an Arab people and those Arab people seeking to restore their homeland. With that conception, each step along the way that the United States has provided support to Israel has further exacerbated the animosity in the Arab world over that conflict. So these have provided some very specific triggers that helped move the process of Islamism forward and gave it greater dynamism. As to what Islamism has promoted, it has promoted the purification of Islamic societies, that many of, I would say, Islamists would say virtually all of the Arab states today are corrupted Islamic societies. They do not represent a true adherence to the Quran or to Islamic law or Sharia. and therefore must be purged and these societies reformed, and the goal of ending Western dominance. Certain elements in the Islamist movements have adopted terror as the tactic to accomplish those goals. Al-Qaeda, of course, the most obvious example that we've seen. A strategy of terror to drive out Western influence and ultimately topple the governments that currently govern in the Middle East. And we have seen the problems of those states, whether they're what we would call, or for lack of a better term, secular states, such as Egypt, monarchical states, such as Saudi Arabia. These states have all been condemned as creating corrupted Islamic societies, and that they must indeed go. So these are the twin goals of the terrorists who have been inspired by Islamist ideas, and this is the latest challenge to the United States. In looking at this set of ideas, the evolution of this mission and the challenges to it, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, we see the overall motivation for the United States in the interventions that we have looked at. As much as we talk about specific motivations, economic, strategic, ideological, the larger vision behind all of them, that those economic, strategic, and ideological components help make up, is this American mission to transform the globe. To meet the challenges to that mission, the United States has used a variety of methods. Diplomacy, negotiating treaties, coming to agreements with countries, foreign aid, providing economic assistance. This is part of the Modernizing Mission, but it is also a way of gaining influence and control. It's a way of accomplishing the mission by helping modernize societies, but it also, of course, gives the United States considerable influence in countries that become heavily dependent upon U.S. foreign aid. Military force as an option. Nothing else works, send in the military. We've seen that twice now in the Middle East in a little over a decade as our way of trying to solve these problems. But through much of this period, the military option was limited in several ways. One, by a very real concern that we would overextend ourselves, something that might have been taken into consideration in Iraq. And secondly, the very real danger in early decades, up until 1989, that a direct U.S. military intervention somewhere might well trigger a Soviet response. American policymakers would be thinking very differently about Iraq in 1991 and in the last few years if the Soviet Union had still been a major world power. At a time when the Soviet Union was providing support to Iraq, and at a time when the Soviet Union would see an invasion of Iraq as an obvious attempt by the United States to seize direct control of the oil resources of the Middle East, that easily could have triggered a nuclear war. At times like that, with limitations on other tactics, the CIA would turn, as it did in Iran and elsewhere, to the Central Intelligence Agency to solve its problems through covert operations. That brings us, of course, to the topic of the CIA itself. And we know that from the outset, when the agency was created, it was really created primarily to serve as a collector, analyzer, coordinator of intelligence information. Again, Director of Central Intelligence Agency, his real title, his important title is Director of Central Intelligence, not just for the agency. The agency was meant to be collecting data from all those other sources, military intelligence, Defense Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, and so forth and so on, putting it all together and providing a coherent picture for the President about intelligence issues. But of course, as we also saw in considering the history of the CIA moved away from that as its primary mission by the 1950s and focused more on covert operations as its principal activity. In examining the history of the agency, we saw a series of reasons why that happened. Bureaucratic infighting. In other words, when the agency is created, these other agencies, the FBI, etc., military intelligence, they don't want to share anything with the CIA, and they're not going to. Cooperation was at a minimum in terms of the centralization of intelligence information and its analysis. So the agency was being prevented in many ways from carrying out its prime directive because of the power of other federal institutions. The influence of the OSS, its predecessor. So many people that came to be prominent in the CIA, including a series of its directors, were members of the OSS, which had prided itself particularly on its ability in terms of covert operations. So that history is carried forward in the person of people like Allen Dulles, etc. The Cold War pushes the agency in that direction because the executive is looking for a way to fight communism without having to turn to a direct military confrontation. Covert operations are something that can be used to fight communism, building up resistance groups in Eastern Europe, etc. But who's going to do it? The military doesn't want the job. State Department doesn't want the job. Give it to the CIA. So the Cold War is another factor that pushes the CIA towards a greater emphasis on covert operations. And then, of course, there's the reality of the Third World, that as much as it was difficult to penetrate the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China in the Third World, where state systems were just being formed, were not fully created, where there were huge gaps and weaknesses in state systems, here was a place where the CIA could operate with relative impunity in many cases, where it could be highly effective because of the relative weakness of state structures in third world countries. And of course, that reality, as well as the kinds of conditions we talked about in looking at each case, local conditions in particular, led to a series of triumphs on the one hand in Iran, Guatemala, the Congo, Chile, where clearly the agency accomplished its goal of toppling a regime and replacing it with something that at least the United States felt was preferable in terms of its own interests. And then certain failures. Cuba and Vietnam in particular, Nicaragua, kind of a toss-up. You could debate both sides of the issue successfully as to whether that's a success or failure. But of course we saw that much of this is determined by the conditions within the country itself that either favor or do not favor the survival of the existing regime. We also saw, in covering the agency's history, the relative decline of covert operations. After we get past Nicaragua in the 1980s, and the Afghan operation of the 1980s, as we head to the end of the 1980s, there is a significant drop-off in the types of covert operations that we have focused on: political subversion, paramilitary initiatives, etc. Part of that is due to the Vietnam syndrome, as it was described, which really means the end of the Cold War consensus. The general agreement in this country that we were fighting a real, if cold, war against communism, and that therefore the executive had to be given considerable leeway to fight that war by whatever means were necessary, meant that the Congress and the American people were quite willing to accept the fact that they weren't going to be told many things about what we were doing, and that some of those things might not exactly live up to American ideals or American laws, but were considered necessary. As a result, relatively little oversight over the operations of the CIA itself. That breaks down, though, with the failures in Vietnam. Americans begin to question our involvement in third world countries, the involvement of the CIA that can often draw us into military confrontations. The consensus about what American foreign policy was about breaks down. Congress becomes much more critical of presidents and their foreign policies in general, whether they involve the CIA or not. And suddenly, without that consensus, the agency has a lot less room for maneuver. Scandals. The various investigations, particularly the Church Committee revealing the CIA's involvement in assassinations, its violation of U.S. laws in terms of monitoring people's mail, Operation Phoenix, which involved the assassination of thousands of Vietnamese communists during the war in Vietnam, and so forth and so on, seriously damaged the reputation of the agency and led to additional oversight on its operations. The fall of the Soviet Union. This was, of course, the linchpin in the Cold War consensus that there was the Soviet Union that was communist and perceived as an enormous threat to this country and its security. With the virtual collapse of the Soviet regime in 1989, that enemy is gone, that justification for a Cold War consensus, and also it raises questions about what is the mission of the CIA anymore. If we don't have this critical enemy, if we are now clearly unchallenged as a military and economic power in the world, why do we need this covert operations agency? Why do we need this intelligence agency? And then, of course, there are the unpleasant side effects from covert operations in the 1980s in particular, with Nicaragua, the involvement with cocaine smugglers that was widely exposed. And, of course, the links between the United States and the Afghan Arabs, those people who were trained indirectly by the CIA, but also by other groups, to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviets, and many of whom then joined a variety of anti-American terror groups, most notably, of course, Al-Qaeda. All of these various developments weaken the agency and its status and its ability, in many ways, to carry out covert operations. The other major function, of course, has always been intelligence gathering and analysis, but it's always been the lesser function. Consistently over the years, far more money has always been spent on covert operations than intelligence gathering. It's always been seen as the secondary factor, and we saw with Allen Dulles how he separated the two because he really didn't want to listen to the intelligence analysts and focused on covert operations. And although subsequent directives were less obvious, it was clear that covert operations was the main emphasis, and indeed, until very recent years, one director after another, when they came from within the agency, came from the covert operations side of the business. Besides the fact that intelligence was consistently a secondary consideration for the agency, there is also the fact that intelligence gathering and analysis are two very different functions and produce two very different rates of success, if they can be measured at all. By this I mean that this country, and many others, long ago established institutions that were good at spying, at gathering information. If we go back to the Black Chamber and Herbert Yardley in the 1920s, one small example, code breaking. And go on in later decades to look at aerial photography and the gathering of intelligence in that fashion. Spy satellites. The National Security Agency, which spends most of its time monitoring telecommunications of all kinds around the globe. and deciphering that information. That we're very good at. That other countries are good at, probably not as good as we are, because we have more technology, we have more supercomputers, etc. But there is an enormous difference between gathering that information and analyzing it. We saw some of the challenges of this when we talked about intelligence gathering and analysis. We talked about World War II experiences, for example, in the Enigma machine, that you may have too much information. The problem is, how do you break it down and get to the key elements that you want? Same thing happens today. If the National Security Agency is monitoring all these telecommunications, the problem is, which ones are really important? If we just say, well, tell the computer to flag anything that has the word terror or terrorism in it, okay, well, we better get 1 billion hits a day. How are we going to break down 1 billion hits a day? There's the problem of, well, if we act upon information we have, we may give away our source and then destroy our access to that information. And there are far more complicated problems that information never comes. Rarely do you get, here's the blueprint for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Here's the blueprint for 9/11. That doesn't happen in intelligence history. Okay? No matter what may have been said recently about, well, there was no clear indicator. There never is. There are bits and pieces, fragments of information that you have to try to put together. And this is where the success rate goes down dramatically. Gathering is one thing. Analyzing it's another matter. Too much information, fear of exposing, tipping your hand if you act upon the information that you have, and then simply the fact that you have a variety of pieces of information. How do you put the picture together successfully? And complicating all of those technical problems that always exist in intelligence gathering, even if we could isolate it, is the political factor. The CIA, no matter what we say, is a bureaucracy. And it operates within a political state. CIA officials know that they need to be in sync with whoever occupies the White House. Otherwise, they won't have a job. You may be further down the ranks of the bureaucracy, but if you're known as somebody who doesn't act as a team player, you're not moving ahead. So there is always, no matter what administration is in, a desire to please the bosses. And that does not mean that analysts simply rewrite history, rewrite their analysis. But they certainly understand that certain interpretations are going to be better received than others. It's not unlike you're writing an exam. Not in this class, of course. And the professor has a very strong opinion about, look, these are the causes of the American Civil War. Well, do you really want to sit there during the exam and say, well, I read this very interesting book, and it totally contradicts what was said in this class, and here are the real reasons that totally contradict yours. Okay, maybe the instructor is a totally rational and logical and objective individual and is going to say, wow, you are thinking for yourself, gathering your own information, this is an A. Maybe. But what are the odds? As opposed to, obviously you didn't absorb the main ideas in the course. And this is a C. The same thing works in the world of the CIA as in most bureaucracies. People understand without being told, without anyone putting it into a document, that you certainly don't want to offend the bosses. That has an effect. We've seen specific cases of this. The uncounted enemy in Vietnam. CIA was estimating far larger numbers for the Viet Cong, for the communists in the South, than the military were. President Johnson and the military wanted the smaller number. And that's what prevailed. Because if it was the bigger number, the meat grinder strategy of simply killing communists until there weren't enough left to carry on an insurgency wasn't going to work. So the smaller number became reality. Was anyone told to lie? No. And there were reasonable differences over, well, who should we count? But the fact is, the politically essential number was the smaller number. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Maybe we'll find something. As of this date, doesn't look like it. But we're not going to find anything like what we said was there. Why? The agency was anxious in part to overcome past mistakes where they underestimated, back in the early 90s, the nuclear program, or the efforts to begin a nuclear program. The agency was getting information from a source paid for by the Defense Department, essentially by the administration, that was, as it turns out, highly unreliable. But of course, would you, as a CIA analyst, say, wait a minute, I can't accept this information because I haven't had a chance to vet the sources? Well, if you want to, do you really want to be up for promotion next year? Okay, looks good. Even if the source is somebody whom the Defense Intelligence Agency has nicknamed Curveball, whatever. These influences are real. Can you find a smoking gun that will show you, well, that's where that pressure was exerted? No, it never happens that way, whatever administration we're talking about. Added to these obvious problems in analysis that pervade most intelligence agencies, because they can't escape the influence of the political state that they serve. There was also the problem, as we saw, of the loss of esprit de corps in the CIA, meaning the agency didn't have the panache, the attractiveness that it once did. After the scandals of the 70s, and especially as the Cold War is winding down in the 1980s, young people aren't attracted to the CIA. It doesn't pay that much money. But people coming out of Harvard, Yale, the Ivy League schools who once flocked to the CIA, they're not going there. No, the intelligent young people coming out of major public universities across the country. Doesn't pay that much. Washington's expensive to live in. And it's a job. There's no longer a sense of a crusade that we're fighting to save the Western world from communism. And we saw, with a variety of examples like Aldrich Ames, that there was a real decline in that sense of mission that the CIA itself had. And finally, there was also the issue of the CIA versus the FBI, bureaucratic infighting that we saw helped shape so much of the CIA's history itself, continued to be a major problem in the 1980s and 90s. In fact, was exacerbated by a series of events that we talked about in the lecture on the Age of Terror. And these further crippled the agency when it came to confronting the specific problem of terrorism and potential threats to the United States in terms of its own territory. As these factors combine to help create the conditions that led to 9/11, we find that even in the aftermath of those catastrophic events, the one reform that has been called for, that has been begging for attention for over half a century, has not been instituted. Setting up a Director of Central Intelligence, give him another name. But setting up a Director of Central Intelligence who really is the Director of Central Intelligence, who has power over all intelligence data in this country, doesn't have to just consult and ask for information, but has absolute power over that information. That, the most critical of reforms, has never been instituted for the simple fact that all of these bureaucratic institutions that affected the course of the CIA's development still have power, as does the CIA itself. And none of them see a distinct advantage. In fact, they see considerable disadvantage in fighting for that intelligence czar, if you want to use an overused term. None of them see that purpose, and as a result, it hasn't happened. So the CIA remains a flawed instrument in terms of the limits of its capacity to affect change, as we've seen in various interventions in the Third World, but more immediately for Americans in the early part of the 21st century, its flaws as an intelligence gathering and analyzing agency, most particularly the fact that it lacks true and absolute control over intelligence gathering and analysis, remain in place today, much as they did 50 years ago. We see, in the end, that the CIA is an instrument of this American mission, a mission which the United States envisions as the transformation of much of the rest of the globe into modernized societies that at least replicate in many ways our own. It's that same vision that sent us to Vietnam, that has driven us to Iraq so many decades later. And the CIA, in one fashion or another, has been an important instrument of that mission for over half a century. As much as covert operations may have declined in recent decades, still the CIA is there carrying out selective covert missions on a smaller scale, and now, more importantly in some ways, carrying on what was always its secondary mission of intelligence gathering and analysis in this new iteration, this new version of the American mission that has taken us to the Middle East with the belief that we can indeed radically transform Middle Eastern societies by radically transforming Iraq. The CIA will go on playing that central role in that mission for the foreseeable future. When we come back, we're going to look in a review process at what are the requirements for the exam, not that you don't know them already, but doesn't hurt for a reminder, homework, and then more specifically, what kinds of questions to expect, what kinds of answers should you be thinking about making for the final exam. We'll come back in a few minutes and address those issues.